Welcome to the world building session. We are picking up where we left off last time. We're working on structures like this based on simple geometric shapes. We are working on shape language, using it specifically to come up with ideas, at least as a baseline for developing architecture for different fantasy or science fiction races, cities, fortresses, etc. This is a good place to start, and if you want to check out the last episode, I will link it below. But we're going to go ahead and get started with these three sets of shapes we have today. First, we're going to be starting with triangles. These are a little different than some of the ones we worked on last time. We did some geometric shapes, as you can see here, but these were not limited to either rectangles or triangles. So it's going to be a little bit more specific. Let's start off with just some simple sketching here. And again, I'm going to do most of these, if not all of these, directly from the front, not worrying about perspective at this point in time. There's a good chance that I will work on perspective at another time, but not today. I do not have any preparatory materials done for this. This is all just off the cuff. And the reason for that is I think it's important to show what that actually looks like. Sometimes things can be prepared for in advance, and it makes it really hard for anyone who's just trying to get a start on things to understand what it might actually look like when you're diving in for the first time. But, as always, I am open to your feedback and your comments below, and let me know if there are bits and pieces of this that would be better served in a different manner, or if you would like me to hit it in multiple manners. So I've given myself a pretty simple sketch here to begin with, and I am just going to go ahead and start moving in. At least on this first drawing, I am going to keep it very strictly triangular, and will try to use as many different things as possible in that manner. It does stand to reason that if you were going to work on this for a long period of time, you probably wouldn't want a culture that would use only something like triangles. You'd probably use that as a base for the architecture, and then would start envisioning other things as you went further and further. I'm going to undo this clip because it's giving me some weird noises. So we'll pull that off and just pray that the pressure of my hand is enough here. So what kind of culture might this be, though, that uses triangles? Well, maybe it's in a region where sand or snow or something similar piles up, and they need a structure that allows for that kind of pressure. I know geodesic domes, homes that are basically made out of octagonal or circular forms, are often able to sustain a tremendous amount of pressure from wind and from snow. And so perhaps it's people like that who live in a region where that is a concern. And so they are making sure that they have structures that can abide those kind of things. And that's probably a more reasonable place than some race or city or nationality just deciding, we really like triangles, and that's what we're going to use. That could, of course, happen, but I think a lot of these things are usually pretty multifaceted in how they're arrived at. You know, the elves in Lord of the Rings didn't just wake up one day and go, well, I think we really ought to make all of our architecture mere plants and living things, because that's cool. I think it was more just like, as their artistry progressed, they found that mirroring natural forms creates the least resistance possible. And I think that's probably why they started doing things the way that they did. Also, when you live that long, it makes sense to mirror those things, but also to build your buildings in such a way where you are going to accommodate for things that are going to grow for a tremendous amount of time. We as humans only live to be, about 100 years old if we're lucky. And most of us don't live in the same place for more than probably 10, 15, 20 years. I don't know what the average is, but at least in the United States, it's not very long. I'm not a good example, but I've lived, I think, in 30 different homes over the course of my life. But even since I've been married for the last 16 years, we lived in a rental place, and we are currently in the third house that we've lived in. So that's 4 places in the last 16 years. So even if we assume most people are, 12 or 15 years, which is substantially more than I've done, then you're not going to accommodate for things like trees and bushes that could take 30, 40, 50, 100 years to develop into whatever they might be. But if you were a long-lived race, you would probably consider those things. So I think those are good places to think about. This almost looks like a carousel or a park of some kind, which was not really my intent, but that's kind of our first sketch there. I'm going to go with this idea that what if these people live in a particularly windy zone, and this is just a way of dealing with that. So let's make the structure like way less tall, and maybe we'll even do it like this, where there's literally like sand or snow buildup on the one side, and we'll see how that works. I don't think it's necessary to have the doors actually be triangles, but it kind of seems like a nice kind of point of consistency that might be kind of cool. And maybe you could actually have like a triangular hat on top of one. I don't know. Let's play with it. Let's see what happens. I don't think it's necessary, and certainly in the last session when I was talking, I didn't want to focus on the reasons why something might be devised that way. That's a departure from how I normally approach things. Normally I try to approach things in a manner where, what would be the logical format in which something like this would actually occur. I think that's a better method to do it. But the way that I naturally do things is not necessarily the best way. It is just a way that I do it. I think it can also be fun to approach things this way, where you are thinking about or not thinking about those things. Sorry, it's the distraction while I'm drawing. But just focusing on the shapes. There's not a wrong way to do this. For me, it's more natural to think about the purpose and then devise afterwards. But there is no problem with going, I want to have a group of people who lives only in vertical structures. And what would that look like? How would that happen? And then build the world elements around it later. There are so many different ways that you can come at world building things. And I think honestly that's part of the fun. Maybe that's most of the fun. I have certainly approached it most different directions. And as I mentioned last time, like a lot of what led to the beginnings of my fascination with architecture and buildings and such was I just wanted to have cool towers. And I had to, create some semblance of a reason for why these towers would exist and what role they might have in the story. And then it becomes pretty logical to think about what kind of people would build those things. So this might be, snow drifts with the wind blowing this way, snow drifting or sand drifting up on the structures. And so you would actually build them in this way. I know most of the triangles I have here are symmetrical, but what if they weren't? What if you did something like this? Ooh, what if you had the shape like this, like really, low, and then you had it sharp over here, and this was the face where like the, snow accumulates or sand accumulates. So you would actually have it be a much more intense angle. And let's experiment now with some different doors and shapes and things like that. So what if we had, I guess we could still do triangular windows. I've actually done this in another one of my videos too, where I thought triangular windows would be cool and maybe a sign of like prestige, because maybe they'd be a little bit more difficult to build or something like that. So let's do some little like planters or pots or something like that. Yeah, let's see how this goes. But you can tell, like, I didn't think about this ahead of time. I thought about it a little bit while I was working on the ones on the prior page. But in general, these are just things I'm coming up with as I'm working. And these ideas might seem silly to you, and they might seem significant to you. And the reason I say that is because I've had people in my professional life at many different times who've asked me, like, how do you come up with so many ideas? And of course, for me, because it's something that doesn't seem to be very difficult, I don't often think of most of my ideas as good. But I do seem to be able to come up with ideas a fair deal quicker than, like, the average person. That doesn't mean that they're good ideas. It just means that I am not worried about things going poorly. I think that's the reason why coming up with ideas comes pretty easily to me. I don't care if I do 2 or 3 dozen of these kinds of drawings and they all turn out poorly. That just doesn't affect me emotionally. Now, if I'm working on drawing a character and that doesn't turn out, sometimes that will mess with me a little bit. But that's partially because I'm just not good at drawing characters. I haven't put a ton of time into it. And so I haven't developed those skills yet. And frankly, I think those skills are harder to develop than skills that would allow me to do things like this. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's certainly how it feels to me. Characters just feel a heck of a lot harder to work on. But coming up with ideas in general, if you think that these are really clever or interesting ideas, first of all, thank you. And second of all, you will start coming up with ideas that are comparable to this very, very quickly if you allow yourself to brainstorm in this fashion. If you allow yourself to spend some world building or sketching or drawing time that is pretty unobstructed by anything else, where your goal is just to play with a shape and figure out what that shape looks like. And you can tell, like, very, very quickly, I started wondering, like, well, what would lead to this? Why would a people group build triangular buildings? Not something that I had thought about before, but something that the second I start playing with it, I'm like, oh yeah, like, I wonder what this would be. Sometimes, like, ideas are things that arrive because you're already in the work. I think we often fantasize about ideas being, crucial and incredibly important, and they have their areas of importance, but an idea by itself is nothing. It's what you do with the idea. That being said, like, working without an idea can be quite daunting and very hard, but ideas will often not come entirely out of the blue. Ideas will often come out of working and investing time into something. At least that's what I've found and what I've seen, and a lot of the material that I've looked up and researched online seems to indicate similar things, that it is not altogether common for ideas just to spring out of nowhere. Like, if you want to write a story but you don't feel like you have a good idea, if you just start writing mediocre ideas, there's a good chance that in that process of playing with things, you will come up with something that is considerably better. Will it be quick? No. Will it be assured? Oh, heck no. But that's not how any of this works. It's almost like, at least to my mind, when you're working on idea generation, whether it's world building or otherwise, it feels like every time you do something, it's rolling a die. And every time you roll that die, I know it sounds weird to say die, but it's a dice, singular. But every time you roll that die, you have a chance of something turning out spectacular, or you have a chance of coming up with an idea that you really like. But you have to keep rolling it. And you've got to find a way to be okay with the ones that you get when the dice turns out that. And you've got to know that you're not always going to get a 6. And maybe, you've got to get several 6s in a row to get something that's really going to be substantial. The reality is, like, ideas are going to come to you the more you play with ideas. And they're certainly going to come more frequently when you don't hold a ton of pressure over yourself to make sure you nail it every single time. I think that's one of the worst things you can do, is just try to make every idea you come up with be good, because they're just not. And if you expect them to be, then you're going to be disappointed, and disappointment makes it harder to get back to the work. And at the end of the day, if you want to come up with cool ideas, if you want to make cool things that are, original or close to original, you're going to have some duds. This drawing right now that I'm working on, I have no idea if or where this would fit in my story, and I don't expect it to. And it would be easy, I think, to just basically turn off the camera right now and go, well, this is silly, this is pointless, like, why am I drawing this? And maybe that's correct. But the reality is, like, I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know if I'm going to finish these and have an idea or an epiphany. I don't know if something's going to occur to me later. I don't know if somebody's going to leave a really cool comment on this video about these shapes and what they might say. I don't know if this video might be of benefit to someone. I don't know. And so I just kind of have to keep working. When I don't know what to do when I'm writing my book, I will sometimes just keep writing. Sometimes I'll research things, and sometimes I'll end up deleting a bunch of what I worked on, and not often. Usually I'll just put it in a different color, because I don't think it's good to erase things so much. I like to leave the evidence that I did stuff. But you just don't know, and so it's okay. Like, you can keep coming back to it and keep pushing it and see what happens. But you've got to find a way to be okay with having ideas that are either subpar or you just don't know where they're going to kind of fit in. I'm going to call this good with these ones. This is kind of interesting. It's got a lot of Native American vibes. Some of this feels Tibetan to me or Mongolian in some ways. Very interesting. I kind of would like to return to this. These are intriguing, but I think I could have a lot more fun with the asymmetry, playing with this idea of like building a triangle specifically as a device to manage whatever weather or kind of geography or climate that you live in. Could be really, really fun. I wonder too if you could build it in such a fashion where you could have gardens along the top of that kind of gentle slope. That's kind of what I was thinking here. These are really, they don't make sense too much, but they're rain barrels is what I was thinking, like the ability to collect the water. So, but I would have to play with that a little bit, especially if it's built to sustain the snow and the sand. You know, if it's one of those two, you're probably not going to be in an environment where that's necessarily going to get a lot of moisture unless the snow comes and melts. And if that's the case, then maybe, you know, you would build structures a little bit differently where you'd actually have them like, you know, catch the snow, or you do something like this, where you would actually try to like catch the snow here and then have maybe an underground reservoir where you catch it. But again, like that literally occurred to me as I'm sitting here drawing and talking and writing. So again, very much further evidence. But let's go ahead and jump down to these guys. So these are very, very simple. Obviously going to, in my mind at least, lend themselves towards stone. And I'm not 100% sure how I'm going to make it interesting. But again, like that's totally fine. It's not like everything has to be perfect on our first go. That's way too big of a door, so let's make that smaller. And we're going to try pretty hard to play with only rectangular shapes, but we'll see what happens. So for me, this always feels a little bit more like an industrial sort of thing. Buildings that are slapped together quickly, maybe just because they had to be. Some of that's the Industrial Revolution. Some of that's just quick, you know, servants' quarters or things that had to be constructed. It's not a lot of elegance to it. So as I play with this, I'm going to be thinking about if there's a way that I could make these things have a little bit more elegance to them. And again, that's immediately me thinking about like what the purpose is. Like, why would you actually end up with architecture like this? And I know that like the dwarves in Lord of the Rings often have architecture that is fairly geometric, but it's a lot more complicated than this. Obviously, this is not, you know, rectangular, but that's okay. So we're just playing with this idea. This is like a stone building, perhaps. We're gonna, you know, we'll do some stuff in here that kind of implies stone, but if I color this later, that would be something that I would certainly indicate with shading, and then also just the grays that I work in there. I just don't want to spend too much time on that right now, because mostly I'm playing with the concepts. So that's kind of feels run down, almost like a silo of some kind. Let's come over here and have this structure that has its own little balcony type thing kind of leaning off here. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe it's an awning or a sign of some kind. Tiny little door. Maybe we'll get some windows leading up here, and then some kind of shed or shack of some kind up on the top. Maybe it's a rooftop type of thing. Obviously, these doors probably wouldn't be pitch black, but I find for the drawings like this, at least, it looks better to put a teeny bit of shading on it. Makes it easy to distinguish that that's a hollow point. Sometimes I'll do that with the windows, but not always. But again, you're going to come up with ideas by trying things out. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. Don't be afraid to try something stupid, try something weird, try something that you expect to fail. The only problem with expecting to fail when you do something like this is not putting enough energy and time into it to actually give it a chance to be successful. Because just because you think something might fail or you don't have high hopes for it, doesn't mean that you can't try to make it work. We're going to try to make this a little bit more castle-like and elegant. We'll see what happens. So I'm actually going to go with kind of what you might assume as a medieval or Renaissance style castle top here. I don't know enough about either to know what is actually real and what has just been constructed in our modern media. That is another area that is really exciting and fun to explore if you have the time or are willing to take the time. The research to figure out how things actually function and how things actually look, I think is really exciting and is one of the coolest parts about, pretty sincere world building. Figuring out new things about how the world around us works. In my writing group a couple years back, the woman who runs it actually came to us really excitedly one evening and talked to us about treadmills. And she was writing a book that was centered on a time period, I think in like the late 1800s, and talked about how treadmills, which we think of as being a modern invention, actually existed back then, back in Civil War times. And I was fascinated. Most of us, in fact, were fascinated by this because we think of them as being a modern thing, but in fact, they are not. They have their roots way back in pre-industrialization. And so it was really fun to, explore that and understand that. And that happened because she was working on trying to have accurate world building and accurate history for the story that she was telling. So this feels very castle-like. Still feels pretty archaic, not very elegant at all. So I'm going to have to think about how you would make these kinds of shapes into elegant things. And again, it wouldn't be a bad idea to start with something like this and then begin to incorporate other shapes. When you are building out a race, a people, a nation, anything like that, there's no reason that you have to stick with a singular shape. I am doing it as a control method. And I would encourage you to try the same. And then once you feel like you've got some cool things, modify and add as you see fit. Let's assume for a second that these structures were built this way simply because it was the easiest way to build when they were originally built. But then as people have lived there for hundreds of years or thousands of years, they're going to modify those structures, change them, make them make a little bit more sense, update them. Technology is going to affect things. So things are going to be augmented. And there's a good chance that this structure is long outdated, but people still build that way because that's just the way that their grandfathers built. And so it's the way they keep building. All right, I didn't do a tower with the triangles, but I am going to try to do a tower here with these just because towers are cool. And I think it's kind of interesting to look at a couple different structures when you're world building like this, using something like shape language, is to try to explore, a normal human dwelling, maybe a market or a building of particular import, and then something like a tower. Because some of these shapes, it's really intriguing to think about, like how would you actually make something tall with that, or something elegant? And so I think those are kind of fun things to play with. So I'm going to start just by segmenting this off as one might do, and try to build it up with all these shapes. It's going to have a distinct Lego appearance, I think, which is great because Legos are awesome. So let's see what happens. We're going to go one more kind of broad one here, and then we're going to do a little bit skinnier down to the base, and then we'll see how that goes. Kind of looks like a gun or a cannon a little bit, like a science fiction version of something like that. But I don't know. We're just stacking a bunch of rectangular shapes. It's a really odd tower. Like, why would somebody build a tower like this, I wonder? We'll do a tiny little door and make this a massive, massive tower. Which, of course, means these grasses that are growing at the bottom are, like, gigantic. But that could be kind of cool. So let's do, like maybe there's up here at the top, there's some kind of walkway that goes around the structure. And I don't know if this structure is a circle or if this structure is like this. I haven't really identified that. I think these are probably circular, the way that they're built. But the way we're looking at them here, they don't look that way. So let's do a little door up here. We'll do some little windows. So this is presumably where folk are going to come and look out. Maybe it's a lighthouse. And maybe this is just the most rigid structure they could build, and it's particularly strong for the winds or the ocean or whatever that they're going to have to deal with there. Gonna have some shading and shadows down on that side just to make it look a little bit more three-dimensional. All right, so yeah, let's just add a little bit more texture here. Maybe this too is a platform, so people could come out here as well. Maybe a nice spiral staircase going up and up and up on the interior. Maybe not if everything's built this way, but then you'd have to have a stairway that goes kind of around the exterior in, you know, this kind of pattern. But either way, it's going to spiral. It's just a matter of if it's a circular spiral or otherwise. So this would also probably be stone and probably set stones. So it might be something like this. And again, you don't have to think about these things while you're working on just the shape language part, but I find that it's kind of entertaining, at least for me. It's good for me to kind of think about those things. Sometimes when I'm struggling to make decisions about why certain things are the way they are, having a little bit of help with the technology or the material used can be a little bit beneficial. This to me just feels like a far more like rudimentary structure. And so this is probably like a less advanced people group, or it could be some really old structures. You know, in fantasy specifically, I guess science fiction as well too, there's a tendency to have the old structures and old things often be like really advanced. But sometimes, like in our old world, that's not the case. Like most of the time, I think you run into like things that were built by an older culture and the technology's worse because it's older. They're not as technologically advanced. So I think both are fun to have. I think it's good to have both of those. All right, with our limited time left, I think we're going to at least start working on these guys and see what kind of things we run into. These are probably some of the more fun and certainly some of the more dwarven when you think about it. So you get large gates or pillars that are going to be in this structure, and it can be a lot to play with. I find that the more complicated the shape that you're working with, the more intriguing things will often become. And that can be a really fun way to execute things. It's probably part of the reason why inevitably we make things way more complicated than they need to be when it comes to a design stance. It was hard for me when I first started studying graphic design, because a huge part of graphic design is making something as simple as you can, and yet it still communicates the things that it needs to. So you inevitably end up with beautiful designs, and then your professor or client is like, yeah, like if we could take this part out and, you know, make that part, you know, a little bit simpler so people can just, it's like, yes, okay, sir. I like the really complicated things. I find them fun, and you know, graphic design is often not about what's most entertaining or cool. It's about what reads the quickest, because you have a limited amount of time for a client or a prospective buyer of some kind to actually understand what they're looking at, and so you want it to be something that can be read. So we've got our little teeny character here, kind of showing the size of this archway. I'm not going to spend a ton more time on these guys because the video is getting long, and also because I think the point's kind of been made, but as I said I would do these, I'm going to do them. Whoop, my hand's right on the side of the sketchbook, so it kind of shifted funky there. Please don't ever feel like the pace at which I draw, the way I draw, is something that you should aspire to. I know that might sound arrogant, and it certainly feels like it coming out of my mouth. But I know just historically that when you watch a person work, it's easy to put them on a pedestal. And please just don't do that with me. I know I certainly would watch my stuff and be like, yeah, nobody's ever going to do that, but I just know better over time now. The way that I work is peculiar, and it works for me, and whatever works for you is what you should do. You know, one really clear round of that is I have clear round of that. Sorry. One clear indication of that is like I have a thing right here where I can put reference material, and I don't keep that from anybody, but like I have reference material there. The desk obviously goes around on the sides here. A lot of times I do the preparatory sketches. I didn't for this. And also, like when I'm not on camera, I move my sketchbook around all over the place so that it's much, much easier for me to draw the lines the way I want to. I actually move my sketchbook tremendously when I'm drawing on my own, but I can't do that when I'm doing this way. So don't watch videos of any artist and then assume that that's the way you need to work. Remember, we all work differently, but more than that, we work differently when we're talking. We work differently when we're on camera. So what you're seeing is only ever a facet of what any other artist is doing. And even if somebody is being as forthright and honest as they possibly can be, you don't know what's happening in their heads. So you only ever have a portion of that picture. So if you find that you just rag on yourself or are hard on yourself for certain things you do artistically, I would encourage you to be kind, to understand that we all work at different paces. We all work at different, things, and we work on becoming proficient at different kinds of things. And what you observe in others is only ever a fragment of what's actually happening. So please be encouraged. Keep your world building, keep doing stuff, keep drawing, because it's good for the soul, it's good for you, it's going to be fun. And it's probably not going to turn out right at first, but it will turn out better more often the more frequently you do things. So keep at it. I'm going to close out this video. These last little structures are pretty simple. I'd like to spend some more time with them, so let me know in the comments below if you would like me to spend some more time on these kinds of things, or if maybe next time you'd like me to try to go, this is a place in the desert, and this is how we would play with this. I've got to take a peek at these two and see if any of these can kind of play into my world, or if they're just tools to help kind of move me forward and hopefully help you. Well, as always, thanks for being here. Thanks for sitting through this and listening. Let me know in the comments below what you'd like to see next. Thank you to my patrons as well, who are on the screen. And if you want to check out the Patreon or the Discord, they're both linked below. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.